1 Samuel chapter 30, I'm going to kind of get a running go at it. 1 Samuel 28 verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel." So that's what's going on. That's kind of set the stage for the last few chapters. 1 Samuel 28 verse 4 says, "And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together and they pitched in Gilboa." So here's your map of what's going on. If you look at the inset here, the little square at the top or down here at the bottom, you see we have the Philistines came up from Aphek. That's where they started from. And they made their way up along the coast, and they came in through Megiddo, and they came into Shunem. Okay? That's where the Philistines have set up their battle lines. The Israelites, now Saul would have had his headquarters down here, and actually kind of covered up by that square. He is from Gibeah. Okay? So he makes his way up, and they pitch in Gilboa, but then we also read that they make their way and they will pitch in Jezreel, which is just beyond, just a little bit north of Gilboa. So the Philistines come up and they make their camp in Shunem. The children of Israel come up and they first come to Gilboa, and then they go up just a little bit further to Jezreel. What we're reading about is the prelude to the battle of Mount Gilboa. That's what's going on here. Everything that we're reading is prelude to that. Now, chapter 28, if you look back at it, it tells the story of Saul seeking a woman with a familiar spirit, or witch, at Endor. And he went and he said, "Call up Samuel for me." And she did. Samuel talked to Saul, and that all happened in chapter 28. But while the events of chapter 28 were going on in Endor, chapter 29, what we looked at last week, it's a short chapter, just 11 verses. Chapter 29 tells us what was going on with David. David, as Saul was in Endor, David was passing in review. Well, along with all the other Philistine troops, David was passing in review before Achish and his generals. So Achish is the king of the Philistines. Achish, again, that's a title, not necessarily a first name. So he's passing before Achish and his generals, and think of it as kind of how you see military parades, where you have all of the dignitaries, and then you have the troops passing in review. Well, they're passing, and some of the last ones in the parade were David and his 600 men. And the generals looked at Achish and they said, "We're going to fight Israelites, right?" "Yep." "Then why do we have Israelites in our army? That's not going to go well." See, they remembered, it was only 11 years earlier when David came to international fame as the one who killed a giant, a Philistine giant, down in the valley of Elah. They remember the songs that were sung in Israel about David killing his 10,000s. And they're worried that when the fighting comes, that David's going to get out there into the middle of the battle, and he's all of a sudden going to switch sides, and he's going to give his men a signal, and they're just going to lay waste to our armies. And so for those reasons, Achish's generals say, "We're not going to battle with this guy. Send him home. Send him back to the city you gave him, and we're not fighting with him." So Achish comes to David in chapter 29, and he tells David, he kind of lays it on a little bit thick. Remember, he says, you're perfect in my eyes. You're a great guy. I have no problem with you, but my generals won't fight alongside of you. So Achish tells David in chapter 29, verse 10, he tells him to get up early the next morning and go back to Ziklag. Go back to the city that I've given you. And this evening, that's what we're going to see here in chapter 30. We won't make it all the way through the chapter, but we'll make it a good ways through. We're going to see what happened at Ziklag. And it starts off with an Amalekite attack. Look in verse 1. "And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day," it's about 50 miles from Aphek down to Ziklag. So 3 days' journey. "And that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire. Now, who attacked? The Amalekites. Where have we heard about Amalekites before? Well, if you remember back in 1 Samuel 15, they're the people who God told King Saul to utterly destroy. Do you remember this? He said, I want you to wipe out everything. I want you to wipe out man, woman, old, young. I want you to wipe out the animals. I want Amalek utterly destroyed. Did Saul listen? No. Who did he save? Do you remember? Who and what did he save? He saved Agag, the king, and he saved the best of the flocks and herds, right? And he said, well, the people, they wanted to offer sacrifices to Jehovah, so he kept this, and Samuel didn't buy it. Samuel said, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. And then Samuel, who was an old man at the time, pulled out a sword, and the Bible tells us that he hewed Agag in pieces there in Gilgal. So that's where we heard about the Amalekites first in 1 Samuel. Since then, David has had some raids against the Amalekites. In 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 8, we read, and David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. For those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. So, David, when he went to Philistia and was given Ziklag by King Achish, he would go and he would raid against the Amalekites. So there has been some back and forth with the Amalekites and the Jews. And there's been some go back and forth between David and the Amalekites. That's important. The remainder of the Amalekites now live in the southern region of Israel. You see it here on the map. You have the southern region down here where you see the word Amalek. That would be called, and if you listen to the news, sometimes you'll hear them talk about the Negev. Okay? Negev means south in Hebrew. So the southern region, you see Beersheba, which is the absolute south city of Israel. Below that, you have the Negev. Actually, it's kind of that whole region. The southern portion, the Negev, has been desert, or at least it was at that time. If you go to the Negev now, you'll find that Israel has done a lot of irrigation, and they've planted a lot of the Negev into crops. But Amalek's in the very south of this region, and the Amalekites would have known that the armies of the Philistines were setting themselves for battle in the north. And so what better time to invade the south than when all the armies are up north? So the Amalekites see this as kind of an opportune time. And while Achish didn't know what David had been up to, do you remember what David had been doing? He'd been raiding against the Philistines and against the Philistine allies and causing all kinds of problems. He would invade a city and he would capture all the stuff that was worth taking, and he would kill all the survivors, so that no one could go and report back to Achish of what he was doing. And while Achish may have not caught on to what David was up to, perhaps the Amalekites had caught on to what David was doing. And perhaps what we're reading about here in verse 1 is an act of revenge. Ziklag, the city that we read about being taken by the Amalekites, had been given to David in chapter 27, verse 6. That was where David lived with his men and their families. Okay, so Ziklag is basically David's people. It's 600 of his warriors, some of the fiercest warriors in the land, and their families. And David's family is also there. Look at verse 2. And had taken the women captive. So they took Ziklag and they burned the city, and they took the women captives that were therein. They slew not any. That's worthy of note. They didn't kill anybody. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Worse than the loss of their stuff is the loss of their families, obviously. Every time I've talked to somebody who's gone through a burglary or a house fire or something, they always say the same thing. Well, stuff we can replace, people we can. I'm glad all the people got out. Well, they get to Ziklag, and it's just kind of a smoking ruin, and everything's gone, and so is their family. Now, we know that the Amalekites didn't kill anyone, but does David know that the Amalekites didn't kill captives? Probably not. They would have looked around. They don't see any bodies. Probably they don't see any blood around, but there's still that kind of that question in the back of their mind. They're gone. And grief on a big scale happens here. Look at verse 4. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. This morning we talked about Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. And not just a lone tear trickling down the side of his face, but sobbing. That's what this is. The Hebrew word means to make lamentation, to bewail, to mourn, to shed tears. David and his 600 warriors are beside themselves with grief. Imagine your army goes off to war, and when the men come back from war, the families are gone. Now, when men go off to war, sometimes there's the idea, well, we may lose some of us, but our families are safe back home. They come back and their families are all gone, and these men are beside themselves. The Bible tells us here in verse 4 that they wept until they were utterly spent. Grown men cried till they didn't have any more tears, till they were exhausted. Verse 5, and David's 2 wives were taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. David is not spared the affliction of his men, but with leadership comes responsibility. Look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed. Again, same reason as everybody else. David is greatly distressed. For the people spake of stoning him. Who are the people? His men. There are no people in Ziklag. They're all gone. So David comes in at the head of his army, and they get there. They realize all of their families are gone, and all of the men break down into tears. They cry till they can't cry anymore. And then it comes to mind, let's stone David. That's kind of a low point for David, no doubt. The people spake of stoning him, back in verse 6, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. So adding to David's distress over his wives and children being taken captive by his enemies, he has trouble within his own camp. It says, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. Grief will make people do things they wouldn't normally do. These men had loyally ridden with David up to go to war, and now they loyally follow him back home, but in their grief, mutiny starts to rise to the surface here. David's men, not only did they loyally follow him to war, but if you think about it, they have loyally followed him all over Judea as he's run from Saul, right? That's been going on for quite a while, but now they feel that David bears responsibility for the situation in which they find themselves. So a question to you, does David bear any responsibility for what happened to the families of his soldiers in Ziklag? What do you think? I see some heads shaking this way. I see some.
I think if all the men that were with him joined up with him on their own, volition, he didn't go looking for warriors. So I think that if they were joining his party, they would have known the risks and what they were
I see what you mean. Here's, yes?
He was also out killing all these other ice.
Yeah.
And so that put a price on his head, so to speak.
Absolutely. David was engaging in dangerous behavior, for sure. Here's where we go. See, we need to do this as we study Scripture. go back a little bit further every time. Should David have been in Ziklag to begin with? No. So does David bear responsibility for what has happened to his men in Ziklag? At least to a degree. Why? Because he's the one who led them there. If David would have been walking with God, where would they be? Well, they'd be in Judah, or they may be up fighting the Philistines, up preparing for battle in Mount Gilboa. But rather, they were doing something that they didn't have any business doing when this happened. So if we trace it back a little bit further, we come to kind of the heart of the problem. David had come to Philistia in a moment of weakness, a moment of weak faith, and now he's suffering the results of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His family and the families of his men shouldn't have been in Ziklag to begin with. God never told him to leave Judah. He left of his own volition. And I think, as we read over this, I think that God is perhaps using this event to get David's attention. David has been secure. He's been able to do whatever he wants, partially because he's got 600 warriors who will back him up. He's been protected by a somewhat naive king named Achish. If you follow and you read through this and you think, boy, Achish was kind of dense, that he didn't pick up on some of this stuff, you're probably right. He seems like he was kind of naive. But David has had free rein to do whatever he wants. But what happens next in verse 6 is a large part of why David is called a man after God's own heart. In 1 Samuel 13 and in Acts 13, it says, at the end of the verse, it says, "But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God." David didn't allow this trial to make him rebel against God. He allowed it to push him towards God. If you've been following along and you've been noticing, David hasn't sought the Lord's face on anything that we have recorded since 1 Samuel 27. That's a long time. That's at least a year and 4 months that David has been kind of freewheeling it just a little bit. God has most definitely protected him. Has the hand of God been on David? I think so. God has protected him. He has sustained him over this time that he's been in Ziklag. But David shouldn't have been there to begin with. And now we have this trial that comes into his life. His family is missing. His city is in ruins. And his men are on the edge of mutiny. Charles Spurgeon said, "I have learned to kiss the waves that throw me up against the rock of ages." And trials can do that. Trials can force us to God. And I believe in this case, David, when it says that David strengthened himself or encouraged himself in the Lord his God, I think that's what was happening here. Especially given what happens next. David hits a low point, so David turns to God. I think as David was encouraging himself in the Lord, I think that he was spending some time in prayer. That he was getting... David's the sweet psalmist of Israel. He wrote most of the Psalms, and I think in this particular low point of his life, I think he got back in fellowship with the Lord. I think things were made right. Where before God was being merciful and God was being gracious, I think David brought himself back into alignment with the will of God, given what happens next. Because, look what happens in verse 7. David inquires of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, Ahimelech's son, "I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod." And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. The ephod would have contained the Urim and the Thummim. Okay, those stones that we don't know a whole lot about. Some believe, I think I've mentioned before, there were two stones, and some believe that one meant yes, one meant no, and that when you would inquire before God, some believe that the one would change, perhaps get cloudy, or some sort of a visible change. Again, that's all conjecture. We don't know. But David asks for the ephod to be brought. Verse 8, "And David inquired at the Lord." Boy, that's a refreshing change. He hasn't done that in a year that we have recorded for us. But David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he, God, answered him, David, pursue. For thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. God immediately gives David an answer. God tells him to go after the Amalekites, and you'll recover everything that's been taken from you. Again, no captives have been killed. And David is told, go for it. Go for it. Go get your stuff back. Go get your people back. Verse 9. So David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those that were left behind stayed. I think this is one of the most powerful verses in reference to the leadership capability of David. What were they ready to do in verse 6? Stone him. What are they doing now? They're mounting up and they're riding after David. Perhaps even his men understood. Hey, David's back in communication with Jehovah. Let's follow it. Things are okay. David communicated with his men. Also, I think that David was a man amongst men. Okay, I think David was a force to be reckoned with. He and his men are now riding after the Amalekites to recover what has been taken. All 600 leave Ziklag. After all, there's nothing there. It was all burned. They leave Ziklag and they take out after the Amalekites till they come to the brook Besor. Now, scholars believe that the brook of Besor was the combination of seasonal rivers in the area of Beersheba. So, if you see Beersheba, you see the word Amalek, just up from that, you see Beersheba, and you see kind of that river that runs right there by Beersheba. That whole area has a lot of runoff. They call them wadis. It would be a dry riverbed most of the year, but that whole area is covered in wadis. And when the rains come, the rainy season is January through April. When the rainy season comes, those wadis fill up. And they start compounding one on another because water adds to water, adds to water. And so you have, when we think of a brook, what do we think of? We think of kind of, a ditch, sort of an idea where you can step over it. That's not what this was, very likely, especially given what happens. The brook of Besor would, at this time of year, very likely have been more of a raging rapids that cuts through on its way to the Mediterranean. So, it was at this place that we read in verse 10 that the people were left. There were some people left at the brook, we read in verse 9. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. So that would lead us to believe this is more than a creek, because David's men, if it was a creek, they'd have walked across it. But there were 200 of his 600 who said, I can't do it. We can't go on. We can't go any further. This is as far as we can go. Why were these men so weak? Why was David forced to divide his army at this time? Well, think about what's happened in the last couple days. They'd made the trip from where they had been with the armies of the Philistines to Ziklag. Again, probably about a 50-mile trek. It took them 3 days, we've read. When they arrive in Ziklag, they discover the worst possible news, and they wept. Verse 4 tells us, until they had no more power to weep. So they were tired from 3 days riding, and then they expend all of their excess energy in weeping for their lost loved ones. And so 200 of David's army are unable to continue, and they're left on this side of the brook of Besor, while the rest of the men make their way and they ford across the river. And they found an Egyptian who told them a story. Look at verse 11. And they found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and gave him bread, and he did eat, and they made him drink water. Egypt was in the area of Amalek. Amalek was a nomadic tribe. They were herdsmen, and they were raiders. And so it wouldn't be unusual for the people of Amalek to come over and kind of be right up against the Egyptian territory. So this Egyptian was found, And he says in verse 12, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread, nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. What do you call a man who hasn't eaten food or drunk water in 3 days and 3 nights? You call him almost dead. He's on death's doorstep when David and his men find him. And they bring him back to health because they understand who this is. They understand, hey, we're looking for our families and this guy might have information. So they give him some water, they give him some food, and it brings him back. He comes back. The spirit comes back into him. Verse 13, and David said unto him, to whom belongest thou? And whence art thou? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me because 3 days agone I fell sick. Nice people, huh? The Amalekites, their servant got sick, so what did they do? They just carried on. Verse 14. This is the Egyptian talking to David and his men. We made an invasion upon the south of the Cherethites, and upon the coast which belongeth to Judah, and upon the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Now, there's some really interesting stuff in here. As I was studying, I saw that word there, the south of the Cherethites. The word Cherethites means destroyers or executioners. Do those sound like people you want to pick on? The Cherethites, when their name means destroyer and executioner. We don't know a whole lot about the origin of these people, but they would go on to have a very definite role when David came to power. We read in 2 Samuel 8, verse 18, it says, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Some believe that David was so impressed with these people, perhaps while he was living in this area, that when he came to the throne, he made them his personal bodyguards. The Cherethites would have been the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers of this day. They were the elite guard of David's kingdom. But in this day, they were just a people who lived down in the south. And the Amalekites had gone and they had picked on them. They had made an invasion upon them. They had not only gone against the Cherethites, they had gone upon the coast which belongeth to Judah. So they had invaded Israelite territory as well. Well, how could they get away with invading Israel? Well, where are all the Israelite soldiers? They're way up in the north. They're up in Mount Gilboa, getting ready to fight with the Philistines up there. It says that they came upon the coast, or upon the south of Caleb. The south of Caleb. Who is Caleb? He's one of the 2 good spies, right? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad, and 2 were good. The 2 good spies were Caleb and Joshua. Caleb was given his inheritance. This is referring to that Caleb. Caleb's inheritance, have you read the song? It's in our hymnal. We don't sing it often. It's called I Want That Mountain. That's based on the life of Caleb. When he was 80 years old, he came to Joshua and he said, I want the piece of land that Moses promised me. And they had a conversation that probably went something like, Caleb, you're old and there are giants in the land. He said, I don't care what's in the land. I'm ready to go take my mountain. And so they said, well, go for it. And so Caleb, at 80 years old, went and cast out the sons of Anak who lived in his mountain, in his territory. And that is the territory that these Amalekites went up against. If you remember, back in chapter 25, we mentioned this in passing, that Nabal, the husband of Abigail, he was of the household of Caleb, and he lived in Carmel. So, we have these Amalekites. They raid the Cherethites, they raid Judah, they raid Caleb, and they burn Ziklag with fire. They had a busy time. Verse 15, and David said unto him, canst thou bring me down to this company? Do you know where they are? And he said, swear unto me by God, that thou wilt neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring thee down to this company. David contracts with the Egyptian slave. He says that if he would serve as a guide and bring them to the Amalekites' camp, that David will protect him, and he won't hand him over to the master who had left him to die. So they set out. And David finds the Amalekites. Verse 16, and when he, this is the Egyptian slave, had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. The Amalekites are living large. They are all spread out. They're having a great time. And they think that all the armies of Israel and Philistia are way up north. They hadn't counted on David getting kicked out of the Philistine army like he had. And so now David's down here and he finds them. David and his men arrive, and the party comes to a very abrupt stop. Verse 17, and David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day. And there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men which rode upon camels and fled. The word twilight that we read, that David smote them from twilight, can mean either dawn or dusk, and it is translated both ways in Scripture. But regardless of whether you take it to mean dawn or dusk, we are talking about a fact that David and his men killed Amalekites for either 12 hours or 24 hours. Either way, this was quite a battle. This was quite a confrontation here. They killed all of them, with the exception of 400 men who were able to escape and flee on camels. Why would David's men and their horses probably not be able to catch Amalekites going across the desert? Well, think about what's happened to them in the last 5 days. Okay? They came down from Aphat to Ziklag, from Ziklag to find the Amalekites. Then they fought for 24 hours or 12 hours, and some of the Amalekites escaped. They made it away. David's horses and men were likely too tired to put up much of a pursuit at this point. It's a complete and total victory. Look at verse 18. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. Now remember, they hadn't just gone against Ziklag. They'd gone against the Cherethites, against Judah, against Ziklag, and also against the region of Caleb's inheritance. He recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil, nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. And David took all the flocks and the herds which they drave before these other cattle, and said, this is David's spoil. So David has not only retaken what was taken from him, he's retaken everything that they got on their entire raiding party. There's no loss of life among the captives, and all of David's men are reunited with their families. Again, it's not been that long since his men were ready to stone him, but David got realigned with the Lord. And now he has complete victory that God told him, you go, you'll get everything back. And God was as good as his word. David did. He went, and he's reunited not only with his family, but he's reunited all of his men with their families. And so peace is now restored. Now we're going to stop there here in 1 Samuel 30 tonight. We'll stop with verse 20 and we'll pick it up. Now you need to remember what we've looked at tonight, or next week won't make any sense. Okay? You have to remember what has happened. We'll review a little bit, but keep in mind that David has gone and he's recovered all. Here's the lesson that I want you to take from this evening. Would you say that what David went through in this passage was a trial? I would say so. The loss of all of his stuff, and the loss, he doesn't know that they're not dead. So, the loss of his family as well. It's a trial for sure. Not all trials are meant as chastening from God. Sometimes God allows trials into our life just to bring us closer. Sometimes God does allow trials into our life to chasten us, but not all the time. But while it's true that not all trials are a result of God's chastening, it is true that all trials will either draw us closer to God or they'll drive us further from God. Every trial that comes into your life will have one of those outcomes. You won't stay where you were. You'll either draw close to God, or you'll be pushed further away from God. As I mentioned, I think what has happened here, when David came home from being with the Philistine army, and he comes back and everything's gone, and all that he had was just a smoking ruin, I think that this was David's wake-up call. It came in the form of an Amalekite raiding party. But what did David do? He immediately ran to God. He didn't fly off the handle. He might have had reason to. He didn't yell at his men. He might have had reason to. What did he do? In verse 6, he strengthened himself in God. He encouraged himself in the Lord. What are you going to do when God sends something into your life to get your attention? When a trial comes into your life, will you allow it to draw you closer to Him? Or will you allow it to form a wedge between you and your Lord? It's important. It's important that you allow what God would have in your life as a trial to draw you close to Him. Don't forget, trials come, they're important. Hold on to them and go close to God. Any thoughts, questions, or comments that you have on what we've looked at here in 1 Samuel 30?
Saul must not have killed very many people at all. Going back to that, I would have thought most of the people were killed off and they just took the plunder of the king. There must have been lots of people who were being killed before it would be this many again that quick.
Yeah. Yeah, you think about how, when you think of a raiding party, when you think of the Amalekites, it would be a lot of men because they killed them for 12 hours, at least, and maybe 24 hours. So yeah, it would have been a large portion that got away. And if you get right down to it, David, when David is king, will be the one who's able to finally kind of put an end to the Amalekites for a time. But if you remember when we talked about the Amalekites in chapter 15, they crop up in the book of Esther because Haman, the one who made the big decree to kill all the Jews, he was an Agagite after King Agag of the Amalekites. So yeah, it's Saul really messed up when he let it go, when he let it slide. Absolutely. Choices, and especially choices to sin, certainly have consequences. And we can't control the consequences. Anyone else? All right, read ahead. Find out what happens next. And then we'll get into chapter 31. Chapter 31 is where Saul will come to his end. He will be wounded in the battle of Mount Gilboa, and it's going to get pretty dark as we come to the end of 1 Samuel. Let's bow for a word of prayer here this evening. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your word and for the examples. Lord, I pray that we would learn from the mistakes and from the victories and successes of the men and women whose stories we have. I pray that, Lord, as we saw what happened tonight with David and the trial that came into his life, Lord, that got his attention, I pray that we would allow our trials that come into our life to push us close to you. And Lord, that we would renew our fellowship with you in times of trial rather than turning our back on you. I pray that you'd be with us now as we go our separate ways. I pray that you'd give us safety. Lord, give us health, strength, and help us to be effective witnesses as we go our separate ways. Bring us back safely at the next appointed time. In Jesus' name, amen.